So first of all, great to be here. I think it'd be great if we all stopped smiling. No, well, sort of. In other words, what I want to talk about is not that things are going very well. I don't think they are, but also that our communities, your community, my community, the ones that are talking about all these goals, like the Sustainable Development Goals and the targets that companies need around ESG, and all the governments that are talking the talk about climate at COP, so on and so forth, it's just not working. And what I want to talk about is why it's not working, and as an economist, I'll focus on the underlying economic theory that I think is problematic. It's basically got us the wrong governance structures of all the different actors. Remember, the economy is an outcome of how we decide to govern public institutions, private institutions, third sector institutions, but especially their relationships. And I think we have the wrong relationships, but also the wrong governance structures. So for me, this whole impact discussion, social goals, and having impact to achieve those goals needs to go to the core of changes within all these organizations. And I have mainly focused on government, not because government is more important or less important, but because it's been the one I personally think has been really badly framed in terms of what policy is for. And that ends up making it really difficult to have good public-private, at some point my slides will go up, right? Good. I was like waiting for the first one. Partnerships. So all of you who've been in a partnership with a man or a woman or whatever, anyway, I won't go there. Relationships. There's good relationships, there's bad relationships. I think we have very problematic relationships and partnerships in our public-private partnerships. Biologists are not lazy, by the way, with the word partnership. They look at ecosystems. And when they look at ecosystems, they don't just assume it's a good thing. In my world, we talk about innovation ecosystems as though it's a good thing. You might have a parasitic ecosystem. You might have a predator-prey ecosystem. You might have a mutualistic ecosystem, a symbiotic ecosystem. So I do think it'd be really interesting if for the impact debate, we can really start asking ourselves, what are the metrics, what's the learning, the experience, the lessons of what a symbiotic, mutualistic ecosystem look like when businesses, the financial sector, governments, and civil society really work together on a problem where the contracts, in an ex-ante way, actually embodied the goals, the impact that we're trying to achieve. And I wrote a book called Mission Economy, which tried to kind of give some underlying thoughts about that. But my new book that I'm writing now, almost done, but it'll take 2 years to come out, is really reflecting on the underlying economics that we need for a mission economy, for an economy that's goal-oriented. And I talk about this in terms of the common good, because the public good, which I'm sure you often use that word, and global public goods like clean water and water for all and health for all, is just this really boring word that we've accepted to mean something that needs to be done because the private sector is not investing enough in it. So it's a correction. Whereas for me, the common good is an objective, not a correction, and the how we all relate to each other matters as much as the what. And if you look at the history of political philosophy, it's quite interesting because when they, from Aristotle onwards, talked about the common good, there was the telos, the goal, but also the polis, right? The city-state. Of course, back in the times of ancient Greeks, they excluded many, the slaves, the women, but today, the polis, in terms of the democratic fora, the places where we also contest and negotiate and formulate contracts along the way to achieving the telos, whether it's net zero or pandemic preparedness for the next pandemic, really matters, the way we relate to each other. So that's kind of the summary of what I'm going to talk about, but I'm going to break it down into some very concrete points that for me are important for economists especially, because unfortunately the finance ministries and the treasuries out there use a lot of economic theory. So not only do we need good action on the ground, but if we don't even know how to evaluate it when it happens, and we use old economics that doesn't really think about some of these issues, then we're in trouble. And COVID should have been a wake-up call, because when it came about, we realized just how badly we were all globally prepared. Just think back to those early days. We didn't have personal protection equipment for frontline workers. I don't know what you called them here in Holland. We called them essential workers in the UK and clapped them on Thursdays, but still then didn't finance, resource, value the social infrastructures where they work, but also the people. We don't see them as wealth creators, the people working in hospitals. We had huge problems globally on test and trace, so the infodemic side of things. We had huge problems around the vaccine. Yes, we got 8 vaccines, but that wasn't the goal. The goal, of course, was to vaccinate the world, and we ended up with a lot of hoarding of vaccines. You'll remember that we ended up in the global north sending over expired vaccines to the so-called global south, and the way the vaccines were produced, all except one, the AstraZeneca one was different because the Oxford University researchers forced it to be different. But we privatized a lot of the knowledge. The patent system didn't change. We didn't share the knowledge, even during a health pandemic when millions of people were dying. And so the vaccine couldn't be produced in some places in the global south. So anyway, there should have been a wake-up call on how to work together. Public, private, civil society, during really what was like a wartime moment in terms of the number of deaths. And of course, there's the climate challenge. Some of you maybe were in Baku last week. I was in Cali, in Colombia, because there was the other COP, the COP16 for biodiversity. And the reason that all these kids are on the street for Fridays of the Future and Greta Thunberg is the inertia that we as a generation have had in terms of really tackling this challenge. Even during COVID, when all this money was circulating, given to different companies that needed resources because of the lockdown, we didn't use that as a moment to reflect on the intersections between the climate problem, the health problem, and how even the bailouts that were given to airlines, for example, or to the automotive industry could have been actually made conditional on big transformations in those sectors, precisely because money was being given out from the taxpayer. And in fact, 56%, that's what it says there, of the COVID recovery funding allocated to energy companies ended up going to fossil fuel projects just very recently. And we still have huge amounts of subsidies to sectors that aren't transforming. So I could go on and on. I can tell you about the water crisis, the hydrological crisis. I just chaired the Global Commission on the Economics of Water. It's a huge problem, and we're all interconnected. Deforestation on one side of the world is related to floods and droughts in other parts, but we're not treating this problem collectively. So again, we get water nationalism, vaccine nationalism. So instead of just talking about the symptoms, biodiversity, climate, health, water, what I'm interested in is the deep change that's required in order to govern any of these complex so-called wicked problems that require technological change, organizational change, behavioral change. But my interest is in how can we actually think internally in our organizations, but also in terms of categories, government, finance, and business, reflecting on how they have actually been part of the problem, how they're governed, and again, how they relate to each other. And the first big problem, I'll just kind of whiz through this kind of quickly because I want to get to the positive part of the story, is that we have accepted that government, at worst, is get out of the way. That's why Reagan is there, but that's not really the discussion now. At best, it's there, but just like as a lump, as money. Money that we ask to be brought in counter-cyclically, or money that's asked to come in to fix a so-called market failure. I don't know why I'm holding these slides, so I'm going to look at them. I'm not looking at them. Right? So if at best, even the public good is fixing a positive externality problem, or carbon taxes are fixing the negative externality problem, or SME financing is fixing the asymmetric information problem, or even that need for counter-cyclical investment, which, by the way, was Keynes's great idea. Before World War II, we actually had constant depressions because we didn't have counter-cyclical government. So everyone was investing less in the bad times, which turned recessions into depressions. If at best even that is seen as fixing a coordination failure, then by design, not by coincidence, by design, we get policies that are kind of patchy, too little, too late, but also kind of negative. You're worrying about something to fail. You're not, again, objective focused. So instead of thinking of market failures, I'm very interested in what does market shaping look like. And I'll explain more what I mean by this. It's not about top-down government management of the market, but actually being explicit that economic growth has not just a rate, but a direction. And how can we help steer that direction to actually achieve more inclusive growth, more sustainable growth, and markets that actually function not only in terms of patching them up, but really actually produce the kind of outcomes we want. Second, in the business sector, you have people like Larry Fink every year writing a letter to all his investors saying, ooh, yeah, we're not doing too well. We need to think about not just shareholder value, but stakeholder value. And yet, we still have huge amounts of profits that are not going back into the system. 7 trillion. I'm not sure how much of a problem actually it is in the Netherlands. It's definitely part of our Anglo-Saxon form of capitalism, which unfortunately is a very large percentage of global profits that are not going back into the system because we've had, just over the last 10 years, 7 trillion, that's 12 zeros, of profits being used just for share buybacks, to buy back shares, to boost stock prices, stock options, and executive pay. So some share buybacks are fine, but that's a symptom. It's not the problem. It's a symptom of this kind of short-termism where instead of thinking about long-term growth, let alone good growth and green growth, just even reinvestment in the economy, in the productive economy, the so-called real economy, we have financialized our corporate governance structures. And I wrote about this in The Value of Everything, actually alluding to some really interesting history in political economy, where in the 1700s, the physiocrats, who were the first economists ever, they were French, Quesnay and Turgot, worried about this, because they actually had the first spreadsheet ever. It was called the tableau économique, where they looked at value when it was created by the farmers. It was 1700s, agricultural society, and they plotted out where that value went, because they were concerned that the money go back into the system to make the land more productive, and they were very worried that there's one class of people that they were calling the sterile class, because they were bringing sterility, lack of reproduction into the system, so the landlords were siphoning off a lot of the money just to dress themselves well, to go to war, and not to actually make the system more productive. And actually, Adam Smith really cared about this too. The reason he wrote The Wealth of Nations is he was very interested in the division of labor and the pin factory example, and he was interested in how the profits being generated could get reinvested back in to make the system more productive with the better division, which would increase productivity, growth, summing up all those companies, wealth of a whole country. David Ricardo, Karl Marx. So the classical political economists actually thought a lot about value creation, value extraction, value destruction, and actually tried to measure the difference. And what I say in The Value of Everything is that we've kind of lost our way by confusing prices with value, which is why actually the head of Goldman Sachs, after the financial crisis, actually said Goldman Sachs workers are the most productive in the world, because he was right. If we confuse price with value, then just because you're being paid a lot, we think you're more valuable. And what we put into GDP is only things with prices. So if you marry your babysitter, GDP goes down. Don't do it. Or if you pollute, GDP goes up. So that confusion of prices and value is a confusion of profits and rents. It's a confusion of value creation and value extraction, but it also resonates in terms of how we've set up our business structures. And this whole debate about stakeholder value, I think, has been a very weak debate because it hasn't actually changed, what I'll talk about in a minute, how we create value in the first place, ex ante. Those relationships between businesses, large businesses, small businesses, the financial sector, and government. And in terms of finance, and I'm almost done, so problematic government, problematic business, problematic finance. A big problem with finance is basically that finance has been financing finance. In the UK, 80% of our financial sector finances insurance and real estate, fire. So our planet is on fire in terms of climate change, but finance is on fire in terms of really not finding its way not only back into the system, but also helping to steer that system. And I know a lot of your work is about different types of accountability and ways in which, from Mark Carney's work as well, he was very interested in this, how can we help finance steer companies in the right direction? But if you actually look at the numbers, there's still huge percentages of finance that are actually not even finding their way into actually creating a more sustainable economy, but even just finding their way into the real economy itself. And the UK is a case in point, but it's not only there in terms of the difference between financial firms and non-financial firms receiving investment. So what I'm interested in is how can we then take conversations like the ones you're having here on impact, goals, whether it's climate, whether it's inequalities, whether it's health for all and well-being, into a new way to both govern our different actors in the economic system, but especially their relationship. And I became very interested, and this is why I wrote Mission Economy, that somehow we know how to do this with things like war. We choose not to do it with our societal challenges, like, again, health, biodiversity, and so on. So it's a choice. And that's also a positive part of the story, because if it's a choice, we can change it. If it was some sort of deterministic feature of the system that made us so inertial, or that made it so impossible to act with rigor, then that would be a bigger problem. So let me actually come back to this, because this is too much of a summary. So what is a mission-driven partnership? Why is it that to get to the moon and back, somehow we were able to get 400,000 people together in both public and private organizations to work very well together? And what I became interested in was that, yes, there was a goal, but there was, if you want, a broad challenge, which was the space race, beat the Russians, the Sputnik moment, military-industrial complex. But what made it happen was that it was turned into a very concrete goal, to the moon and back, in a short amount of time, so they treated it urgently, but especially that they actually changed the contracts. They knew they had to work together, but the first thing that the guys in NASA did, and it was a guy, his name was Ernest Brackett, the first thing he did was change the contract at the center of how public and private would work. So procurement, which in every country is often 30% of the government budget, 20 to 30%, was really boring. It was just a contract, just moving money around from here to there, and they changed it from cost-plus procurement to mission-oriented, fixed-price procurement with incentives. You would get more if you innovated and increased the quality along the way. And it was through that kind of design change at the level of the interface between business and government that we ended up achieving, sorry, I'm going backwards here, all these spillovers along the way, right? So the big goal was to the moon and back, but just like with climate change, you might say net zero, but the real problem is how do we build, how do we move, how do we eat? So for the moon landing, it was what would the astronauts wear? How would they go to the bathroom? What would they eat? How would they eat it? How would they move? And it was the solutions to all these sub-problems that required purpose-oriented businesses, mission-oriented governments to work together that we ended up with camera phones, foil blankets, baby formula, software, all these technologies that ultimately, by the way, also determined growth, right? Because these technological changes required public and private investment. Growth is a result of public and private investment. Right? So having a purpose-oriented, problem-oriented mindset that by design required investment, but not just investment. Let me just see which way I'm going here. Why am I going backwards? Oh, sorry. There we go. The no excess profits clause that they put in, right? So it's both problems, but also because NASA also knew its self-worth, they put in issues around fairness, like a just profit. What does that mean? Just meaning not more than what you're doing. Like NASA was doing a lot, the private companies were doing a lot, but no excess profits, coming back to the physiocrats, worried about sterility and extraction. It was no rents, basically using the word rents, which today have come back, by the way, because there's lots of evidence that the recent inflation that we've experienced globally in the last 2 years was not demand-led inflation, which can be combated with higher interest rate, but supply-side inflation from the excess prices, excess profits being earned in particular sectors like energy and food. So this is just a very deep reflection that I thought was super interesting because, in fact, if you break this down and what it means today with the 17 SDGs, the 169 targets beneath them, imagine if we took them as seriously with the same level of urgency that kind of moon landing of, space race, to the moon and back in a short amount of time, lots of different sectors, nutrition, materials, electronics, and those bottom-up projects that were aligned actually towards the goal, of which many failed. We just know the successful ones, right? So for me, this is what a mission economy looks like, with huge collective intelligence, collaborations between public and private and other actors, where the sum is bigger than the parts. But if you don't actually have mission statements that are clear and hold the system accountable at the level of contract design, whether it's procurement, water rights, states own often the water rights, but they just give it out to PepsiCo and Anheuser-Busch without any conditionality. 80% of our industrial wastewater is not recycled. which is crazy. Just put it in the contract if you own the water rights. But using those kind of conditionalities on public loans, subsidies, guarantees, any interface where there's a contract that's, again, mission aligned. But this is not what we end up with. So in Europe, I wrote this report, which was great because often academics write stuff and nothing happens. But now there's a missions instrument in Europe. Unfortunately, it just got stuck in one DG for innovation. It never went to the center of the Green Deal, because missions really, for the government side, should be about interministerial thinking, right? Climate is not just for the Department of Energy. It's just as much for the Department of Health, the Department of Finance, in the same way that the moon landing was not just aerospace, it was all those different sectors, but also in terms of the government really having that interministerial capacity. So the point of missions is to reframe how we also think about collaborations between the different actors in the economy in a goal-oriented way. And that then requires not just talk about mission this, mission that, but what does it mean for all the different tools that we have at our disposal? And I mentioned procurement because just think of all the things that are procured, right? So if we care about hunger, which is one of the first SDGs, and Lula, I just came from Brazil recently, has put hunger as one of the biggest challenges in Brazil. Imagine if you normalize this mission thinking. Imagine if it became something as normal as school meals, right? School meals should be healthy, tasty, and sustainable. This is something Sweden has done recently because their high-level challenge is a fossil-free welfare state, and they've normalized what that means even for the way the Department of Education, Department of Health work. But procurement is how you work with the private sector, because it's private sector companies that will be procuring in those school meals. But if it's an innovative goal, then the how those companies are working with the state structures, but also diversifying the competitiveness, if you want, of all the different companies that are interacting with the state around a public goal, can also be thought about. So the competitiveness, because you're no longer over-reliant on the big incumbents. In the UK, we over-rely on this French company called Sodexo to do all the catering in my university and many different universities. So mission-led procurement, in the same way that the one that got us to the moon to find all those different solutions along the way, can also just be used for very kind of normal things like school lunch. And I work both in London with Camden Council, where I live, but also in Brazil around thinking about this. Banks, public funds, there's lots of sovereign wealth funds, there's 22.2 trillion, it's a lot of money, in national development banks like the KfW in Germany or BNDES in Brazil, Cassa Depositi e Prestiti in Italy, but it's often just wasted. I know in Italy, that's where I'm from, we just give out money. When a sector needs help, the steel sector, it's always in trouble. It gets a subsidy. What is a mission-oriented interface between public finance and private sector investment look like? In Germany, the KfW, in recent years, because they had a very clear Energiewende, they put as a condition on that loan to the steel sector that the steel sector had to lower the material content of production in order to get 1 penny out of the government. The only reason we have green steel in Germany is because of that, not because they went to Davos or the World Economic Forum, where some of us sometimes go, to talk about purpose this, purpose that. They had to. How they did it was up to them. If you tell companies what to do, if you micromanage the process, you kill entrepreneurship, you kill innovation. It's a top-down. That does not spur growth. But a clear direction, and then the how, up to you. That is the moon landing, right? The government said, to the moon and back, we have all these problems to solve. Here's some money if you help us solve the problem. How you solve it is up to you. And there was lots of failures along the way. So really interesting to learn from those examples. The EIB, a very important climate bank in Europe. I don't think, from my experience, there's been enough thinking what this means to turn that bank into a real climate bank, which is what they like to call themselves. What does it mean for their own obsession about their risk rating, or rethinking how they think about their portfolio and risk analysis? I wrote a report actually for UNDESA at the UN, their economics unit, around this kind of thinking. How can we get an SDG multiplier by thinking of a new relationship between the MDBs, like the EIB or like CAF in Latin America, the national development banks, and their relationship with the private sector by really being much more aligned with those SDG-related goals at the contract level, like that example of the KfW. And this perhaps is the most important point for this conference, because I do think, as I've said kind of dismissingly, that stakeholder value is like this thing that tends to happen ex post. How do we create value differently so these issues around our common goals, but also collective knowledge sharing and collective reward sharing ex ante, are embedded in those contracts? And already that KfW example is one of them. And I wrote a paper recently with Danny Roderick from Harvard about this, which is how do we learn from these issues of reciprocity, mutualism, and symbiosis from an industrial strategy that is not just about picking sectors, that doesn't work, the picking winners problem, but picking the challenges and really going after them, but with these ideas of knowledge sharing, profit sharing, reinvestment of profits instead of share buybacks. And there was some experience I had in the US with the CHIPS Act. Gina Raimondo, who was the Secretary of Commerce, is still, for a month, with Biden, how to design into the CHIPS Act, which was close to $400 billion for the semiconductor companies, to make sure that that grant helped to steer the economy to be more inclusive. So companies benefiting from that have to improve working conditions, use energy-efficient supply chains, and limit their share buybacks. And that's, again, it's not a shopping list. It was critiqued a bit as an everything bagel policy, but getting the right list, fine, that's going to be a design challenge, but definitely having a contract that's a fair contract and helps steer economic growth instead of just a bunch of giveaways, which is what happened in Silicon Valley, where huge amounts of public investments and all the things that make your smartphone smart, internet, GPS, touchscreen, Siri, all publicly financed, and somehow we didn't think through some of these conditions, which then make us now, too little, too late, trying to regulate a sector which has kind of gone completely berserk in terms of the excess profits that have been earned on the back of a huge social infrastructure that didn't really think through a better design. Interesting that during COVID, some countries actually thought this through. As I mentioned before, don't let any crisis go to waste. This is a mean-looking Bruno Le Maire, who's the finance minister in France, who put conditions that those companies benefiting, like Renault and Air France, from COVID bailouts had to commit to reducing their carbon emissions, whereas in the UK, we gave $600 million to EasyJet, no conditions attached. So there's lots of experiences on how to do this. Maybe that wasn't perfect how they did it in France, but it's these issues. How do we get case studies of where we look at good relationships, good ecosystems, mutualistic ecosystems, including, by the way, with the vaccine. As I mentioned, we had 8 vaccines, but most of them were produced in very problematic ways. What do I mean? Intellectual property rights are not rights from God. They're rights from the state for 17 years to earn monopoly profits, and yet over the last 50 years, we've allowed intellectual property rights to be too wide, often used for strategic reasons, too strong, hard to license, and too upstream. So we're actually privatizing the tools for research, which is not what patents were meant for. And so I recently chaired this commission for the World Health Organization around health for all, the economics of health for all, where we asked, what does it mean to value, to innovate, to finance, and to build capacity around these health for all goals? And that example I just gave would have been from an innovation side. I already told you I'm thinking about the common good. There's too much on this graph to tell you about at the end of my talk, but basically where I'm moving myself and thinking about this from the entrepreneurial state to value of everything in mission economy is we need a dashboard. Like, how do we hold all these different relationships accountable with an agreed dashboard around admitting that there's always directionality in the system, but exposing where it's coming from, and also bringing that public purpose to the center, issues around co-creation, collective knowledge sharing, reward sharing, and transparency. So I'll come back in 2 years and tell you more about this, because again, I'm writing a book about it. This was from an article I just wrote. But I do think that a lot of what I'm talking about is that relational value that needs to be paid attention to. And lastly, all of this requires huge amounts of capacity in our public institutions, our private institutions, our financial institutions, even just capacity to work together well. People like the word collective intelligence, but that requires trying it out. What does it mean? Again, holding that concept accountable. And I wrote the big con recently on how the McKinsey and the McKinsey-fication of our economies, if we want to think of it that way, how we've had way too much outsourcing, which, by the way, the head of procurement in NASA in the 1960s had already warned about. I have a quote by him in my Mission Economy book. He said, if we continue to outsource NASA, We won't even know how to work with these 400,000 private sector people. And he said, we're going to get captured by brochuremanship, because they didn't have these nice PowerPoints that we all use now. They had brochures, these like shiny brochures that companies would bring into NASA to say, we can work with you. And he said, of course we need to work with the private sector, but we won't know how if we continue to outsource our brain. So capabilities matter. We did a study during COVID of the countries that did the best. It was in the developing world. It was Kerala, Vietnam, Togo, Rwanda, on the back of previous crises they had had, where they actually made the radical decision, which most countries don't, to invest within their civil service, even in things like, the infodemic side, as I mentioned, of COVID requires knowing how to govern digital platforms, but turning all our organizations and public and private institutions into learning organizations requires insourcing that investment in order to work well with others externally. And Gov Labs are super interesting. It's something I've become very interested in. Like in Chile, they have El Laboratorio de Gobierno, which is a safe place for government officials to work with private sector people on experimenting, trial and error. Why can venture capitalists brag about all the mistakes they made to get that successful investment? And as soon as a civil servant makes a mistake, bang, front page of the paper. So embracing uncertainty, embracing experimentation together in order to collaborate well is super interesting. Oh my God, my time's up, so it's super last. I keep saying lastly, and then my slides keep going. I think I have two more. As I mentioned, I just chaired this Global Commission on the Economics of Water. It's a trilogy, right? Nick Stern did climate, Dasgupta did biodiversity, myself and those three wonderful people, including the head of the WTO, did water. And really what we argue here is that we have to turn this global hydrological cycle into a mission-oriented approach with that common good framing. Otherwise, we're not going to solve it. Similar point we made in a report just released for the G20, which I co-chaired with Vera Songway, where we say, of course, to tackle climate change, we need green industrial strategies, green financial policies, but unless we govern this stuff with global equity and global justice on top, we again get nationalistic policies. So think of the IRA, Biden's IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, huge amounts of green investments, but unless we have technology transfer and knowledge sharing, then what you end up having is a big siphoning off of green capital from Africa to the US, and that doesn't make sense given that the problem is a global problem. So read the books. Hopefully this is my last slide. Read. Done. Okay, good. Okay.
Applause, everyone.
Too many.
Amazing. Yeah, please do. Mariana, I love how you said, I keep on clicking, but the slide just keep on coming. Yeah. Typically, that's what I say when like I take a test or an exam. I'm like, okay, you said stop, but my pen just keeps on writing after time. Yeah. Talking about keeping on writing, I don't know about you guys, but I was able to write along a lot. So I can imagine that there may be many questions in the audience for you, Mariana, or many things that people want to perhaps ask you more about. I literally wrote down everything. Also, don't marry your babysitter.
Don't marry me.
I'll take it to heart. I don't know, maybe one day in my life it might come in handy. But for now, I would say let's continue that conversation. And to do that, I am actually...
Actually, if you marry her or him and continue to pay them for the work, then it's fine. Then GDP won't fall. GDP falls.
That is interesting.
If the work was being done and you were paying them, then you marry them and you stop paying them, then GDP will fall.
Okay, actually,
just keep paying
focus on this specific point in a little bit, but it's a good one. And I would say, again, lots of points to tap into and dive into. And for that, I would love to invite two more panelists to the front stage with us. So may we get a big round of applause, first of all, for the CFO of the Port of Rotterdam. And she was also the winner of the Chief Value Officer Award last year. Can we get a big round of applause for Vivienne de Leeuw? Vivienne, welcome. Take a seat. And we also saw him at the opening. He is the director of the Impact Economy Foundation. A big round of applause, everyone, for Werner Schouten. Welcome. Werner, Vivienne, I don't know about you guys. I said that I was able to write a lot of things. We tapped into the babysitter point. Beyond that, I was very curious to hear from you. How do you sort of reflect on Mariana's keynote that we just heard?
Yeah, maybe I can start. I'm inspired by the mission-led approach and also the common goals. It's something that actually I've seen working in a port with 3,000 companies in it. It needs to be collective needs to be done collectively to increase your impact. So that's really something that stood out for me.
Yeah, and maybe Vivienne, if I can already zoom in a little bit with you. I mean, Mariana, you shared a lot of like the constraints that we're dealing with, but also what we need sort of to overcome them. I mean, Vivienne, you're the CFO of the biggest port of Europe. How do you sort of make concrete in your day-to-day practice what Mariana was just speaking about?
What we do, and maybe a little background, the Port of Rotterdam indeed is the biggest port in Europe. We have a big energy cluster, and 13% of all energy we use, but the whole of Europe uses, 1/3, is coming through our port. 14 million containers enter our port or leave our port, and 25% of that is food and medicine. So we have a big role to play in the port, and as I said, with 3,000 companies, we need a common goal to make sure that we have the impact that we need in Europe.
Yeah, is it something you're well able to do?
We're working hard on it, but I'll allude to it later.
Okay, that's a good point. Werner, maybe going over to you. How do you reflect on Mariana's keynote?
Yeah, I mean, there was just so much in it, but I think
There's more slides.
Start clicking now.
Oh, but I think particularly also reframing the role of governments as not only fixing markets, but actually shaping markets and shaping also the direction of markets is, I think, an essential element that we often doesn't get enough light, so to say. And particularly, I think, also in a time where we've come, if you look into climate policies, we've come in some sort of subsidy race between continents. And I think if we do not include sufficiently these sort of, let's say, these public returns as a result of these subsidies, then you get sort of the privatization of the benefits, and I think the publicization of the costs. And I think that's a big risk also in this time. And I also liked how you started that we should stop with laughing, because I mean, like, this whole stakeholder debate that has been going on for way too long, this stakeholder capitalism, as long as it doesn't change how we look at value and how we define value, I think sort of we're not getting into the root cause of our issue. And that's what we've been trying to do with impact accounting in organizations, but it really needs to be in the shape of markets as well.
Yeah. I see a lot of resonating.
You're such good listeners. I'm brainwashed.
Perfect summary.
No, but it's exactly that. How to create value differently. And the first thing is the narrative. You know, have you ever heard a school teacher say, I'm a value creator? And yet, again, the head of Goldman Sachs said, you know, those who create most value are Goldman Sachs workers. They're the most productive. That was the quote. They're the most productive. After being bailed out, by the way, by 10 billion, which this bank too. Wait, we're in AMRO, right? It was bailed out too, right? Yeah. And then the funny thing is, oh, but we gave the money back. Really? I mean, if you take into account the risk, you know, again, the socialization of risk, privatization of rewards, it was a complete scam what actually happened after the financial crisis. Similarly, if you think of Elon Musk, who now we have to think about a lot, Minister Musk, is that what we're going to call him? D-O-G-E?
Oh my God.
Minister of Dog? Is that the ministry is called Doggy?
I think, yeah.
Dodgy. It's so interesting to see how that was structured. The investment, but it wasn't called an investment. That's the thing. Language matters, right? It wasn't seen as an investment. It was a guaranteed loan that Tesla received from the Department of Energy in the US. Yeah. And so on the one hand, it's a great part of the story, right? The US government, while here in Europe, it was austerity, austerity, austerity after the financial crisis. There, they were like, all right, let the Europeans kill each other. We're going to do a fiscal stimulus. So Obama did 800 billion fiscal stimulus, and he wanted to direct it towards a green economy. So he had this guaranteed loan program from the DOE. It was just one of the many things they did. By the way, by actually talking about a fiscal stimulus that was green, he managed to get a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, Steve Chu, to even want to be a minister of the environment, because it was exciting, right? It's not just make a carbon tax. So the story is that they gave Tesla $465 million. And this is early days Tesla. This is when it was hard, right? $465 million in the early days is a lot. And same amount of money, just a bit more to Solyndra. Everyone knows the Solyndra story because it failed, and it became this narrative, government is so stupid, they don't know what they're doing, government shouldn't invest, get out of the way. And what they said to Tesla was, if you don't pay back the loan, we want 3 million shares in your company, which is like stupid, right? Why would you want 3 million shares in a company that's crappy and doesn't pay back a loan? They should have said, if you do pay back the loan, which they did in 2013, we get 3 million shares in your company. Price per share went from 9 to 90 in 2009, 2013. That difference, 90 minus 9 times 3 million, would have more than paid back the cylinder loss and the next round of investment. So it's a narrative change, right? It's about not lender of last resort, but investor of first resort, not de-risking, but socializing risks and rewards. Tesla would benefit, right? But so would the public coffers that then can do it again for others. Instead, by just thinking of de-risking, facilitating, enabling, correcting market failures, it's just set up to fail.
But is it that simple? Because the thing that baffled me whilst listening is, you said just put it into the contract. You know, going by all these examples, we have bill-out clauses without conditionalities, without conditions as to what should be delivered back. Is it truly as simple as a narrative and a perspective change that is needed to sort of bridge that gap? Because I could also imagine, and maybe it's a very sinister way of looking at it, but there are a lot of incentives at play and powers at play to sort of prevent you know, not so super chill conditions from happening. How do you look at that?
So, I mean, part of it is the confidence, right? So the narrative gives you the confidence to even try to strike a deal. I often joke that I come in as an economist and I come out as a life coach. I'm like, come on. You know, like, if you don't value yourself, you're not going to actually achieve a good deal, right? So that's the narrative change. But you also need to know how to negotiate, first of all, and if all the lawyers, the top lawyers are on the side of Pfizer, you're probably not going to do a very good negotiation. There is a de-skilling at the legal sense as well. It's really interesting to look at that. Yeah. You guys should do a study on that. But also, it's also about institutions, right? It's not just about contracts. So, for example, DARPA does it for the Department of Defense. Why don't we have, actually we do now, we help them set it up, ARPA-H, ARPA-E. So these innovation agencies that by design worry not just about the supply side finance, but the access. When DARPA funds health, because soldiers get sick on the battlefield, DARPA is an innovation agency in the military, in the Defense Department, they care that the soldiers get access to the medicine. Yeah. So they will design the relationship with the private sector because they care that the soldiers get access because they want to win the war. Yeah. When the same government spends $40 billion a year on health innovation, because that's what the National Institutes of Health spend on health innovation, they don't make sure the prices reflect that contribution. They don't make sure the intellectual property rights are well structured. Right. They ex post worry about Medicare, Medicaid, redistribution, or in this part of the world we have civilization, so we actually have, you know, health systems and so on. But that's like the taxpayer is paying once, twice, 3 different times. Just get it right from the beginning. Get the right prices, the right intellectual property rights, and of course have your welfare state, but don't waste so much time redistributing and regulating. Get it right from the beginning. Yeah. And in war, we do it. Why? Because we want to win the war. Yeah, and we feel the sense of urgency and give it the same gravitas in that sense. I want to go into a different topic. Given that this is the context that we're now operating in, the system that we're operating in, I wanted to tap a little bit more into the topic of economic competitiveness. So if we're really focused on, you know, I mean, a lot of you here in the room, you're at the very forefront of trying to drive change, whether it's through your enterprises, social enterprises, you know, acting on social and environmental impact first and making that broad analysis. Vivienne, if I can go to you, when we sort of look at the position also of Europe in a way, right, focusing on sustainability, putting that at the forefront, and societal impact, broad prosperity, do you think that that can give the EU sort of the unique competitive advantage that is needed sort of in the global landscape to, you know, compete with other regions like the US, China, other places that we see?
Yes, I see it as a chance to do so instead of a risk. What a lot of people look at, that if we do too much, that we will lose competitiveness. I see it as a chance, especially as I said, the port is important. Especially the companies in the port are important to get that strategic autonomy for Europe. It's the goods and the industry that give us our food, that give us our safety and our income. And I think we have a role to play. In the port, already when the Paris climate was agreed, we signed up and said the whole of the port is following exactly those goals. So we created a narrative as a port. We want to be climate neutral in 2050 and 55% reduction in 2030. We actually also made concrete steps how to get there. And not only for us as a company, but for the port as a whole. And we're also making now steps to make it concrete into contracts. So if contracts come up for renewal within our company, we set sustainability goals first, and then we look at price. Another thing we do, and I also heard you mention it, and I heard it earlier today, it's not only the companies in the port, but it's also the suppliers of those companies or the users of the products that are being produced in the port. Everyone has to do their thing. You're one system. So what we also do when we procure, we ask our suppliers to come up with best quality, best sustainability, best price. But we've added something that's called kansendossier, a chance card that they can put into the bid, where they come up with their own ideas how to make it even more sustainable. And the funny thing is, for some of the projects that we've got back in the tenders, the price went down.
Interesting.
So it can be a win-win.
Yeah, that's great. Interesting.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much. We can have a big round of applause for that.
That's great.
Thank you so much, sir.
That's exactly what NASA did.
Sir, I always love it when people do that. That's encouraging it. Werner, you want to respond to that first?
Yeah, no, so I think if you talk about sort of, also I've spoken about that at the start of this day, of course, earlier as well, but I think also looking, connecting to your keynote is that sort of, if we look in the toolbox that we're using currently for, on the one hand, making the transition towards climate neutrality, and on the other hand, supporting our competitiveness, I think we see an over-representation of subsidies, and I think an under-representation of setting ourselves norms. And what creates that is some sort of sunflower capitalism, where sort of the companies are sunflowers that sort of move towards the money-giving sun, which is the government. And when the subsidy stream stops, then also the innovation stops. But I think we know from a lot of research, also what the Draghi report is about on competitiveness is sparking innovation, is increasing R&D spending. The single thing that sparks innovation and R&D spending is setting clear norms. We've seen that in the car industry, when they set clear emission norms actually for cars in the long run, that sparked a huge amount of innovation actually in the car industry itself. And I mean, we've only used that, I think, to a limited extent. We now see a sort of subsidy race existing, but I think it would be much more valuable if we not only get supply side norms, which we've done for the car industry, but also more demand-side norms, that we maybe urge that our buildings are built with emission-free steel, that our cars are with emission-free steel. Because, I mean, like, transforming a steel plant costs multiple billions of euros, but getting emission-free steel in a car only costs 100, 200 euros extra per car. Right. And I think that is sort of the untapped potential in our current sort of policies, which creates markets for actually these impact-driven products. Yeah. It creates this sort of impact protectionism, because sort of you're only allowed to enter the market when you can sort of follow our standards. And I think it's, in the long run, it costs much less public money than sort of the road that we're currently on.
Yeah. Mariana, is that something that resonates with you?
Yes, but I think taken to an extreme, it doesn't work. So I completely agree with your basic point, and the subsidy race doesn't work, and just giving out handouts and then praying at night and hoping it works, it doesn't work. But I would take issue with the way you get innovation is simply to have some sort of stable rules and certainty and the right incentives. The whole reason I wrote The Entrepreneurial State was, where did Silicon Valley come from, and where is the future of, kind of AI in Europe going to come from? It's not through the old recommendations that you just need kind of, leveling playing field, and you need good high-level, say, basic research, and somehow the VC industry is going to allow it to get commercialized, and good SME support. It's a very different lesson. What happened there was a distributed network of decentralized public actors across the whole innovation chain, working very functionally, at least on the investment side, I don't think on the access side, but anyway, with the private sector. So you had not only, the National Science Foundation, without which we wouldn't have had the Google algorithm. We had DARPA, without which we wouldn't have had the internet. We had InQtel, the CIA's big venture capital fund that no one ever talks about. But anyway, the CIA actually invested in the touchscreen display, so be careful when you... Anyway, so then there was procurement policy, which was the SBIR program, which meant that every single government department needed, still today in the US, use 5% of their budget to procure in innovative solutions from small companies. So it's a very different thing than just give money to SMEs. It's create a market so they can scale up. Instead of just starting up, scale up. And even further downstream, you've had historically demand-side policies like suburbanization. Don't ask me if it was was a good idea or not, but without that, the mass production revolution wouldn't have had a market. So creating markets, right, not just fixing markets, requires definitely what you're talking about. Like you need, clear incentives. You can't just give subsidies and guarantees, but you need also that capacity and that scaling process that we haven't had in Europe. And in Europe, we just don't have like proper demand-side policies, even as a region. Every country kind of does its own thing. We don't, in Italy, we don't have half the institutions we have in Germany. Germany has the KfW, the public bank, the Fraunhofer centers, which are very functional places where science and industry meet. In half of Europe, we don't have that. In Spain and Greece and Portugal, Italy, we don't have that. And what we ended up having in Europe was a little internal war, which is the crisis comes along and we say, for the pigs, terrible word. Goldman Sachs is always the cause of all problems. It was their word. They called Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain. I'm Italian. That's terrible. The pigs. Anyway, they were saying the pigs has been spending too much. No, the pigs were not spending enough. Like there should have been conditions on the bailout money that they needed to invest more in the capacity they need to become competitive. Instead, it was cut, cut, cut. And I actually think the rise of populism, sorry, this is now going to get a bit into politics, but after like 15 years of what we saw in Europe, which actually caused quite a bit of misery, in the UK it was the worst, the level of austerity we had. Instead of using that crisis as an opportunity to rethink finance, not just bail out the banks, rethink productive competitiveness and capacity, rethink what did the US really have. It wasn't just venture capital. Venture capital in the US always came after. I have all the data for all the big sectors from biotech to AI and nanotech. VC are not risk-loving at all. They always come in either after business angels, but that's just family and friends who are rich. Most people don't have that. But really after these very strategic, early stage, patient public funds that the US has and Europe doesn't have. And VC then rode that wave, which is fine, by the way. I don't think it's a problem. What's a problem is the returns. The 220 model doesn't recognize that actually they didn't take most of the risk. And I think that's just a question of getting that number better. But also capital gains tax in the US went down by 50% in 4 years, lobbied for by the National Venture Capital Association. So they're benefiting from these huge public programs that the US has and not paying back into it. And the companies that are benefiting, don't even pay tax. Amazon doesn't pay tax. Google doesn't pay tax. So the whole thing, it's an opportunity to rethink it, not from some sort of socialist agenda. It's capitalism, right? It's capitalism. But they're benefiting. It's like corporate welfare and socialization of risk and privatization of reward is not how a capitalist model should work. And so as much as I agree with everything you said, and definitely on the siphoning out of green capital from the global south, going to the global north because of these subsidies, that's really bad for development. But it's just not true that all we need are good incentives. We need the active, strategic, mission-oriented public investment, which historically has crowded in the private sector investment.
Yeah, exactly. So it sort of refers back also to what you said when you have the mission, but then you also need the instruments, the institutions, and the tools. We might have a bit of an empty toolkit in Europe when it comes to that specifically. It's quite interesting. There is so much to go into, and in a little bit, I would also love to hear from the audience, see if you have any questions for our speakers. But before I do, I want to go to you, Vivienne, because when we talk about all these sort of like forces and dynamics that are at play, I was really curious when it comes to the leadership also that you guys, try to embody, exhibit at the Port of Rotterdam. How do you sort of ensure that broad prosperity, societal impact, if you will, remains at the very forefront when you're dealing with so many external pressures as well? I mean, just the example of lobbying goes to show, but of course it goes way beyond that. How do you keep it at the core?
We took leadership, as I said, several years ago already, signing up for the common goal. And the difficulty is to show that added value is not only the economic value, but it's the social value as well. And the difficulty is that that last part has a higher value if you actually calculate it at the cost to realize it. And that's why we look at the port as a whole. It has an economic benefit, but especially also a social one, being education, being welfare, being well-being. So what we do is try to create an environment where the companies actually can earn money, but demand that they set steps in the sustainability part. And we enforce that with every instrument we have, and we help them also make agreements with governments to actually make them realize their sustainable goals. So we use everything in our power to do so.
Do you have any examples that you could share where you sort of really can see that you put the societal impact at the very forefront in that decision making?
Yeah, one of the things we are, let's be honest, the part in the Netherlands where the most emissions are still there. So that's our biggest challenge. That's where we make the biggest impact. So one of the projects that we started, I think already 7-8 years ago, is the Portals project. And you can be against or for storage of CO2, but we see it as an intermittent step to get to the next phase. And that project is actually costing us a lot of money. We don't earn money on it. But that was deliberate because the impact we make on the CO2 reduction emissions is much bigger. And that's why, and I think it's the right first step to make.
Yeah. That's really interesting.
May I ask a question about that? Because in the with the logic also of course your keynote, I mean, like for the companies that are engaging in it, probably saves a lot of money in not having to pay extra sort of carbon credits or having to pay sort of those rates. So how is that sort of divided? Sort of shouldn't you actually make a proper profit out of it? Just out of curiosity.
Well, the companies you refer to are the ones bringing in the CO2. And they use the credits to actually be able to build their next phase sustainable plants. So Shell now is building their electrolyzer on the Tweede Maasvlakte. It's a big investment, over $1 billion, $1.5 billion. And they don't even know now if they can put it on, because the carbon credits they were supposed to create by making these arrangements is being taken off the table by the government. So they're still going on building their plant, and we're helping them build the plant.
Yeah, but that's a really good point, and it's a good question because you're going into the essence of sort of how do we redefine value and make sure that it counts. Werner, from that perspective, when we talk about sort of redefining value and what it means as the director of the Impact Economy Foundation, it is your reason of being, I shall say. Could you maybe speak to that a little bit? What do you think? Maybe you can share some of the work that you guys are doing to ensure that is being done, but also what are some of the biggest constraints yet that we see that need to be overcome to get there?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So I think if we talk about sustainability or be stakeholder capitalism, then sort of often you see sort of, if you look at annual reports, you see these sort of very clear financial statements with figures like P&Ls, etc. And then you get to the sustainability statements, and then it sort of becomes like a novel with beautiful pictures and with sort of like stories about programs, which is great, but it shows sort of that sort of impact is in a sense not really as hard and rigorously steered upon as we do with financial value. And I mean, like for organizations, of course, it's existential if you don't manage your financial value well. It sadly isn't the case yet for impact. But as a result, it's too often sort of a door on the second floor of an organization, but it's not really at the heart of organizations. So we figured like that's what the work of the Impact Economy Foundation has been about over the past years, is that like, okay, what if we look at this financial structure of financial accounting, of measuring, reporting and steering on financial value with all the instruments that come along with that, with forecasting, with discounted cash flow models, with net present value calculations and whatnot. Yeah. And what if we sort of, it's a great system, it disciplines the whole economy, disciplines every single organization, but it's a bit narrow because it only includes one type of value, which is financial value, for one type of stakeholder, which is the shareholder. So what if we extend it by also quantifying and valuing our social value, or contribution to social cohesion and human rights and equality, human value and natural value, including all dimensions from biodiversity to climate to pollution and resource use. so that you actually can create an integrated profit and loss statement, and that you can steer your investment decisions not only on your financial ROI, but actually your impact return on investment. And that is exactly what we've been doing. There's been this great breakout on the ABN AMRO Sustainable Impact Fund with $500 million in assets under management that steer their portfolio based on the impact return on investment. There are even some impact investors that say like, okay, we don't only want to make a financial return on investment, but we make our carry also dependent on our impact return on investment. That per euro invested, we want to see €2 worth of social, human, or natural value being created. And that, I think, sort of taps into the heart of sort of how we define value within organizations. So I think we need the leadership from these organizations that are doing this. And we have increasingly also pension funds, grid operators in the Netherlands that are leading on this.
Yeah.
But I think if you talk about the constraints, the second part of your question, I think, is that we lack, I think, in terms of leadership, this focus on system entrepreneurship. Because at a certain moment you run into sort of the boundaries of what you can sort of, sometimes impact and profit go along and it's a win-win, but sometimes there are lots of sort of nature-based solutions, etc., that don't match the sort of like risks that we demand from our finance. It's not that we have that we have a finance gap, we have a profitability gap often. So we need to make sure that it's in the business case. And we lack, I think, leaders that sort of help shape sort of these playing rules for the economic system that make sure that actually the most impact-driven companies become the most profitable companies in that sense. And that is what we work together on with coalitions.
Yeah, exactly. And I know that you do that with all sorts of parties, right? So it's corporations, it's coalitions with companies, it's also public sector, everything actually bundled together, which is something
Can I just ask a question? Do you, under the S bit, look at, so the social bit, at how a company, if you're looking at the corporates, work with others, including, I mean, even that example I gave of tax, like there's increasing evidence actually that renewable energy companies that look like they're doing good in terms of the what, the how is very dysfunctional. They're actually #1 right now in terms of lobbying for very problematic and regressive tax deals. So tax is just one example of a social relationship, right? There's a public and private, and there's a tax commitment. And if you're lobbying for lower tax and excessive lobbying for that, or avoid the tax in whatever way, how do you look at that? But also coming back to this notion of stakeholder value and how you organize collective intelligence differently, do you look, like, do you compare? That example I gave of the vaccine is nice because we have all the data, right? So you had AstraZeneca and Pfizer, and one agreed to do something good in how they produce the vaccine. The other one has a history of refusing. Pfizer is actually one of the most financialized companies in the world in terms of share buybacks and all sorts of other things. They've always refused. They blackmail a lot of countries in terms of the how, in terms of the patent, the knowledge sharing, and so on. So just something as concrete and objective as in the pharmaceutical industry, if you're a company, what evidence is there that a company has or has not shared knowledge which was required for that goal of social impact? You know what I mean? Like, it's an objective thing, which I can see. In fact, the same company, Pfizer, looks good actually in a lot of metrics that actually have nothing to do with how they produce. So it seems like there's a bit of a mismatch between how the rankings are being made and the kind of everyday, bread and butter of what the company should be doing to actually achieve social impact.
True. No, I think that's a very valid point. I think of course, keeping your public your IP for yourself, of course, that is something that sort of limits actually the social value that you can create, or let's say the intellectual value that you. But
it's the abuse of the IP. IP is fine. I have nothing against patents, but many companies have abused their power around that.
So in one of our in our framework, what we work is also with sort of the reference scenario. So I think you make the reference between sort of an organization that makes it public and doesn't abuse it, and an organization that does abuse it. And I think that is what we look into, is that we look into the sort of the impact pathway of an organization, and we say like, okay, many organizations actually only report on their inputs. We've invested so much in circular economy, or we get 30% of our revenue from sort of circular products, which doesn't tell us much about the actual impact that you're making in society. So we say like, okay, we want to have clarity on what is the actual contribution you make to well-being in society. And then also check that, of course, like, on an absolute level, even the most sustainable companies are still harming natural capital. But if you set it next to a reference scenario, sort of the average in a sector, then they are sort of avoiding a lot of emissions. And the same holds for your example. And that is, of course, a key element in our framework to make sure that you actually show what sort of the relative impact is of these organizations in society.
I'm getting oh, now everybody's looking at you, Hanneke, sorry. But the sign that we are almost out of time. I would, however, like to take one question from the audience. Don't make me choose. Let me go there.
Hybrid, so interesting.
Yeah. I don't know that guy's name. I chose a very new name, I'm joking.
Wow, thanks. I'm very lucky. I'm Stefan. I work at the CPB Bureau for Economic Policy Analysis. Maybe a very quick question. I mean, we started off saying there was someone who was very positive, saying the energy transition is going pretty well now, more or less. But let's move to a more wicked problem, which is biodiversity loss. So very hard to quantify. We don't know a lot about the effects, right? Like of policies on biodiversity or like... and so I guess my question to you, Professor Mazzucato, would be: what advice would you give to, say, a port of Rotterdam or a government or like a financial institute for mission-oriented policies to actually improve such a hard to quantify mission as biodiversity loss?
Interesting.
Nice question. Thanks.
Are we getting more? Just one? Okay,
Yeah.
just you.
We're gonna get
I mean, I'm not a
brief in answering. We can maybe do one more.
Okay.
Yeah.
After
Pressure.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in no way an expert on this, so I'll just say what I think, but take it with a grain of salt. With the water report that we just wrote, what was interesting was that we looked at the green water, so there's so much emphasis on the blue water in the rivers and the oceans and our lakes and our aquifers, but the water that transpires is 70% of the global hydrological cycle, and that depends fundamentally on on biodiversity. So as we, get rid of the as we deforest, as we hurt the wetlands, there's actually a really interesting wetlands commission that has looked at the importance of biodiversity for that transpiration process. We actually can measure that. It just hasn't been measured. So one thing is, what have we been measuring? The other thing is it really that hard to measure, and do we care about it? And so there's all sorts of ways that people, including the Dasgupta report, but also, again, this water report, have looked at the connections between climate, biodiversity, and the hydrological cycle. And I worry, actually, if we start making these metrics too distinct, even having these COPs, a COP on climate, a COP on biodiversity, it kind of potentially creates a divide and conquer. And I think, even the water report that we've just done could turn into disclosures kind of, in fact, we were just talking about it, now that we should afterwards think together about how the recommendations made in the report could translate into some metrics that we use to make sure, for example, lithium, right? Lithium currently that's needed for electrification, that's, SDG 13 on climate, the way it's being extracted is too heavy on our waterways. And so we're solving one problem by creating another. So the kind of systems analysis that's required across the SDGs, but also across the kind of ESG targets. But I think you're right, biodiversity and water have not been treated as seriously as climate, but climate hasn't been treated seriously either. Yeah. So, and I think one of the reasons is also it's not going to the core of how we produce, how we, distribute, and that's why I'm very interested in really, bringing back that kind of objective lens that the classical political economists had. Yeah. Literally, Adam Smith, he, was looking at who does what and why, who earns what and why, and that requires looking at the production process, and having a biodiversity lens would be super, super useful, both for the company disclosures, but also the kind of government metrics. Yeah. But if we make it its own thing, unlinked to climate, given how much we know that they're related, it just, again, becomes another silo, and then people pick and choose which bit they like and which bit they report against. So we need a systems approach.
I love that. And thank you for the question, a really good question. So it's really at the very core about integrating. I'm getting the kill it off right now sign, or we drag you all off. So transitioning to the next segment, I do want to ask you one final question, Vivienne, which is that we're going to go into the Chief Value Officer of the Year award. You were one of the winners last year, and given that we just ended the conversation on the importance of integration, I wanted to ask you, just before we go over to that segment, last year you were awarded the award. Why is it so important also for Chief financial officer, but we say chief value officer, to sort of make sure that we integrate impact into business decision making in that sense?
I think it's very important because we've all been trained the old-fashioned way. Is economic value is pricing and euros, and I think people expect at least from CFOs to actually make the first step in that it's not about financials, it's about financials and social value. So the whole chain. And we are in the board. We are there to make the change. And if we take it to board level and we actually make it an intrinsic driver to have value put in first, then the rest will follow. And that's, I think that's our goal.
Yeah, I love that, a natural flow. Thank you all so much. May we have a big round of applause, everyone for Mariana, Vivienne, and Werner.